Bonespear is an incredibly fun build to play. It does ludicrous damage, it's extremely fast, and it is so good in every form of content. It wrecks bosses, it speed farms nightmare dungeons, and with the right setup, it is practically unkillable. I love this build.
This right here is my favorite thing.
The difference between the setups required to smash Nightmare 100 dungeons and the setup required to crush bosses is not that different. We only have to swap out a couple of legendary powers in order to achieve much better single target damage. So that makes it very easy to swap between the builds. On top of that, this build scales absurdly hard with Ubers. Grandfather, Harlequin, and Starless Sky are all god tier items on this build. But the build actually works extremely well even without these. If you look at the footage on the screen right now, this is a side-by-side comparison of fighting Uber Lilith with all the Ubers and fighting her with no Ubers. And you can see that while the Uber version does more damage, the non-Uber version actually still crushes. This build is designed to clear content as fast as possible. I always prefer things that are done automatically versus things I have to do manually. And when we get into the build, you're going to see that it's designed to just blast through content. So let's get into the build and see exactly how it works. We're going to start by talking about the gear, because the gear is, in my opinion, the most interesting part of the build. So this setup that you see right now, this is what I run in almost every form of content, aside from the pants that I'll swap out. But I'm going to tell you what replacements to run, and I'm going to tell you what you should run in both bossing and in nightmare dungeons. So on my helmet, I'm running Harlequin. Obviously, this thing is just ridiculous. It does everything you need in this build, but Deathless Visage is also an extremely solid substitute. It has a nice damage effect on it, the stats on it are extremely good, and the damage effect can proc the aspect of exposed flesh that we'll talk about later that's going to give us essence on hit. So overall, the Deathless Visage is a very solid alternative. And remember, in that Lilith kill that you saw a minute ago, that kill was with no Ubers, right? So keep that in mind, this is the setup I ran for that. On our chest, we're going to be running the aspect of Shielding Storm. We're going to keep this for both Nightmare Dungeons and Bossing, because on Bossing we don't need any more survivability, and in Nightmare Dungeons this is an incredibly powerful ability, incredibly powerful aspect. So what I'm running right now is 2 damage reduction rolls, a max life roll, and an intelligence roll. You don't need the intelligence roll, I just run it because I don't need any survivability in any form of content. But if you're first assembling the build, I would try to look for 4 damage reduction rolls. On our gloves, we're going to be running the Splintering aspect. This is going to give us a nice damage increase in single target, and it's going to substantially increase our AoE damage, because it's going to cause the splinters from the Bonespear to pierce enemies, and it'll apply vulnerable. So that vulnerable application will accelerate the rate at which we clear Nightmare Dungeons, and the AoE is bigger, so we're doing more damage to more enemies. So this is just an incredibly good aspect, plus it's really good in single target. On your gloves, you want crit chance, lucky hit, ranks of Bonespear, and you want attack speed. I have an int roll right now. I don't have perfect gloves yet. It is what it is. On my pants, this is for bossing. I run the Blood Moon Breachers, which might seem really weird, but let me explain. So the ranks of amplify damage is a 8% damage multiplier, right? So this is a nice damage bonus. And on top of that, it gives us a chance to, on our overpower, we do 70% bonus damage, and we have a 3% chance to overpower. So we have a 3% chance to get the bonus from overpower and 70% from the pants, which isn't a huge deal, but you know, compared to nothing, this is pretty good, right? I love these for bossing. I always wear these. But when I do Nightmare Dungeons, I swap them out for a pair of Juggernauts for the 6,000 armor, which is obviously ridiculously good, right? 6,000 armor. Disobedience is also great, but the problem is disobedience is conditional. You have to actually be doing damage to stack Disobedience. I love Juggernaut because it just always is on. I love this aspect. And on our pants, I'm running 3 damage reduction stats, and then I'm running a very weird stat, which is Crowd Control Impairment Duration Reduction. Now, in the Lilith kill, you saw that I was using Blood Mist, but in no other form of content do I run Blood Mist. This is because while you're in Blood Mist, you can't do damage. I want to do as much damage as I can, as fast as I can, and I want to clear everything at the speed of light, right? I don't want to sit in Blood Mist and not be able to do damage. So I actually run Crowd Control Impairment Duration on my pants and my necklace, so that when I get CC'd, 35% of the duration is cut off of it. And so I'm crowd controlled for way less time, so I'm able to much quicker get back into the fight. You can use Blood Mist to break crowd control, but you have to cast Blood Mist, and then you get stuck in it, and then you have to reactivate it to get out of it. And by the time you do all that, I'm already out, and I'm already casting Bone Spears again. So I love this setup. So on our boots, we're running movement speed and essence cost reduction. Those are the two most important things. And then we want intelligence. And then for our final stat, we can either do movement speed after killing an elite or damage reduction while injured. And for our aspect, we want the Wind Strikers aspect for increased movement speed. This will make it faster to get to bosses. And so, like, you know, you can Bone Storm while you're running through all the mobs to get to a boss. And the Bone Storm will proc these and will give you the movement speed. And then, obviously, when speed farming Nightmare Dungeons, the movement speed is amazing. Okay, so our weapon. So the weapon is a really interesting slot. So I run Grandfather in all forms of content because it's amazing, right? This item is ludicrous. It gives you tons of survivability, tons of damage. This item is just crazy. But in the clip you saw with no uniques, with no uber uniques, I was running the aspect of Serration. And this is an incredibly powerful aspect on our weapon, as we can get an 80% damage buff off of it. And then in Nightmare Dungeons, what you want to do is put this setup on where you run Lidless Wall and a one-handed Serration. So Lidless Wall is going to cause you to constantly spawn Bone Storms, and those Bone Storms are going to give you the buffs, right? You're going to get the crit chance, you're going to get the damage reduction, and all of them are going to proc the aspect of Shielding Storm. So your shield generation is going to be crazy, you're going to be able to be permanently buffed, and it gives you 100% uptime on Bone Storm when you're speed farming Nightmare Dungeons. So this setup ends up being really nice. I actually wear this sometimes still, even with Grandfather. I still sometimes wear that setup. So, stat priority on weapon. Intelligence, all stat, and then any two additive damage modifiers. Any of them are fine. On our necklace, I've got that crowd control impaired duration. I love this stat. I think it's very good. And then I've got movement speed, cooldown reduction, and then any multiplicative damage passive, whether it's, you know, exposed or not exposed flesh, you know, any of the bone skill multipliers or amplify damage, they're all great. And then I'm running the aspect of Grasping Veins, which is going to give us crit chance and crit damage whenever we corpse tendrils. So this is an incredibly powerful ability, because the crit chance gets us to crit cap, so we're always critting every single cast, and we get a 60% damage multiplier on top of it. Grasping Veins is insane. I sometimes like to run the Melted Heart instead of corpse tendrils, but honestly, like, because it gives you a lot of survivability, right? And it has the movement speed, it makes you unkillable, and it gives you 60 maximum resource, so you can do you still get damage multipliers because of the maximum resource, and ultimately the extra damage from Grasping Veins and its ability to just shred bosses, this is just so valuable. Okay, so the next aspect is the Ring of Sacrilegious Soul. This is a unique ring. The stats on it are amazing: lucky hit, max life, max essence, ranks of corpse skills, which will reduce the cooldown on corpse tendrils. This is all fantastic. And then the effect of the ring is extremely good. It's going to autocast corpse explosions, and it's going to autocast corpse tendrils. Both of those effects have incredibly high value. The corpse tendrils will group enemies, it'll apply vulnerable, it'll stun them, it'll CC them, and it'll proc the aspect of Grasping Veins. So if you time your own cast of corpse tendrils with the autocast of corpse tendrils, you can keep up 100% buff time on the necklace. That's very strong. Now the corpse explosion, when we get into the skill tree and Paragon board, there's a ton of things that make the corpse explosion good. So keep this in mind, we'll talk about it more in a minute. For my other ring, I have the Ring of Starless Skies. This ring is broken. This is probably the best uber unique for the build. It might even be better than Grandfather. This thing is absolutely ridiculous, but the aspect of Exposed Flesh is also very good. The reason is because, so the aspect of Exposed Flesh will give you a chance on hit to generate essence, right? If the enemy is vulnerable. Now, what's interesting is the Deathless Visage actually has a decent lucky hit chance rating on the explosions that it creates. And that will actually proc the ring, and it's going to give us a lot of essence generation. And on this ring, we want crit chance, lucky hit, resource generation, and either like maximum life or a damage additive stat. So that's the gear. One last thing I'll mention is the gems. I am running Topaz in all of my gear, because as long as I'm not CC'd, I can't be killed, but I'm going to get CC'd all the time. So in this setup, you can see I have 7 Topazes. So this is 70% damage reduction while crowd controlled. When you get crowd controlled, you pretty much can't die. And this includes like slows, by the way. So if there's a mob that slows you, you become like invincible while you're slowed, which is kind of funny. Jewelry, actually, you just want to res cap, right? So you can see mine's a mess right now because I'm not wearing my proper jewelry. But you want to get to res cap. And so with the different Paragon boards and stuff, things change. But generally, you want to run diamonds. Sometimes you can fit in a skull, but not always. It just depends. And on the weapons, we want to run greens for critical damage to vulnerable enemies. So in the Book of the Dead, we're going to be sacrificing skirmishers for 5% crit chance. We're going to be sacrificing cold mages for a 15% damage multiplier against vulnerable. And then we're going to be sacrificing the Iron Golem for 30% crit damage against everything all the time. This is extremely strong. And the next thing we're going to talk about is the pet, the construct. So for a long time, everyone thought the construct sucked, including myself. And I was totally wrong. We were all totally wrong. The problem was that we didn't level up our construct yet, and we didn't get all of the unique powers for it. But once you get them, it's kind of insane. Just look at this flash of adrenaline. 12-second cooldown, 12-second duration. 50% damage buff. 50% damage, 100% uptime. This is just 50% damage. To do this, we're going to be putting on Genesis, duration support, and tactical support. And that's going to increase the duration, and it's going to reduce the cooldown. And that's going to give us 100% uptime on this. This is crazy. Now, the second thing, if you noticed, in the build that I run, the full Uber version, I don't even run resource generation. That's because the pet generates so much resource. So we're going to be running Tempest. The reason for this is because it has a 0.9 second cast time. So it is going to spam Tempest all the time, and it's ranged so the construct doesn't have to move. Then every time it casts, it's going to generate resource. Right now, for me, it's generating 14. At maximum level, I think it's 17. And that is a ton of resource. Every 0.9 seconds, you get 17 essence. Holy crap, that's so good. Then, right now, so there's a few options that you can actually run for your tuning stone. So breaking support for vulnerable is very good. We can also run the efficiency support for a 12% crit increase. This is going to generally be your highest damage increase. But against bosses, I like the breaking support for 100% uptime on vulnerable. And then we can also run Safeguard, which is going to give us damage reduction with 100% uptime. And at maximum level, this is going to be like 15% damage reduction, 100% uptime. That's extremely good. Alternatively, we can run the Fortify support, and it will keep us permanently fortified. So you have a lot of options for what to run on this slot, and especially if you don't have Evernight. So I have Evernight, which gives me +4 to all of my skills every single time I cast. This is 100% uptime. This is insane. This is a second Harlequin. So, yeah, definitely farm your construct as soon as you can. But if you don't have Evernight, like I said, you can run Fortify, you can run Safeguard, you can even run the attack speed one, Swift support, which you can see reduces its cast time all the way down to 0.7. So, you know, this is a lot of cast, this is a lot of generation of resources. So this is how we solve our resource problem. The skill tree for this build can work in several different ways. This version that I'm presenting now is meant to be good for all content. It's going to crush Nightmare Dungeons, and it'll be good for bosses, so you won't ever have to switch your skills between the different forms of content. So on our basic skill, we're running Bone Splinters. With the enhanced Bone Splinters, we're just getting the 2 points to get to the next skill category, honestly. We're going to be running Unliving Energy with 3 points to Imperfectly Balanced. I don't think it's worth capping Unliving Energy. There's just too much high-value stuff, but the inherent damage multiplier on a Perfectly Balanced of 15% is totally worth it, and the increased essence cost requirement is not that hard to pay. We're obviously putting 5 ranks into Bonespear. We're getting Enhanced Bonespear, which will give us the shards, and then we're getting Paranormal Bonespear, which is going to give it 5% crit, and it's going to spawn 2 additional shards when it breaks. So this is a massive damage increase. 3 points into Hued Flesh. This is going to give us corpses against bosses. It's going to give us a 12% chance on hit to spawn a corpse, and 24% against bosses. So this is extremely important, so we can have targets for Corpse Tendrils and Corpse Explosion. Speaking of Corpse Explosion, we're going to be taking it, and we're actually going all the way to Blighted Corpse Explosion. which at first seems really weird. But the reason we're doing this is because this build clears so fast and it does so much damage that we don't need more damage. What we need is more movement speed. And remember, our Sacrilege is automatically going to cast Corpse Explosion, and that's actually used to proc Reaper's Pursuit because it's a darkness skill, and it's a dot that sits on the ground. So we're going to get 15% movement speed every time it ticks, and so we're going to be able to get 100% uptime on this 15% movement speed, which is awesome. We're going to be putting 1 point into Grim Harvest, so this will cause our Sacrilege ring to generate 2 essence every time it eats a corpse, which is pretty nice. And then we're going to be putting 3 points into Field by Death, so that every time a corpse gets eaten, we get 9% damage. We're going to be running 3 points into Death's Reach for a 12% damage multiplier, 3 points into Amplified Damage for 12%, and we're obviously running Decrepify, going to Abhorrent Decrepify for the 15% chance to reduce our cooldowns on hit. What's cool about the Decrepify in this build is the Harlequin gives us +4 ranks, which obviously I know everyone doesn't have, but the pet also gives us +4 ranks, so we're getting up to +9, so Decrepify ends up being like 30% damage reduction, which is pretty insane. So what we're going to do is we're going to aim to Decrepify bosses. Remember, we don't want to stop and Decrepify every mob, right? It's not worth it. We don't need to do that. But we will want to Decrepify bosses in some big elite packs we can Decrepify. That way we can get the damage boost and the damage reduction. So, like I said, we're getting a ton of ranks from our gear and pet of every single skill. So for Corpse Tendrils, we only need 1 point of it in this build to easily cap out its cooldown reduction. And then we're going to be running Plague Corpse Tendrils full of Vulnerable. Like I said, 3 points into Reaper's Pursuit for the movement speed. And then, so Serration is not that good. Even with how much maximum essence we have, the crit chance increase is not that great. Plus, we're already getting to crit cap anyway. So Serration's not doing a lot for us. But we will be putting 3 points into Compound Fracture for 15% damage, and 3 points into Evulsion for 15% damage. We're going to be putting 3 points into Inspiring Leader, which will give us a 12% attack speed buff, which is fantastic. We can afford this. We have plenty of essence. So the extra attack speed is just extra damage. Plus, it makes the attack speed animation shorter, which allows us to move faster after attacking when speed farming. 3 points into Stand Alone for the 18% damage reduction, and then 3 points into Momentum Mori for the Skeletal Warrior and Skeletal Mage sacrifice buff. Finally, we're going to be running Bone Storm, with Prime Bone Storm for 15% damage reduction and Supreme Bone Storm for 20% crit chance. And Ossified Essence is going to give us, look at this, 85% damage multiplier. That's pretty insane. This is ludicrously good. So definitely make sure you get Ossified Essence. Try to keep your Essence near cap before you Bone Spear. Let's talk Paragon board. So we're going to be running the Sacrificial Glyph on our first node, which is going to give us 10% damage. And then we're going to be going into the Bone Graft, which will give us 8% and 16 max Essence, which is those are damage multipliers, so this is extremely good. And there's important magic notes to point out here, which is Essence on Kill, Essence on Kill. So we're actually getting 2 Essence on Kill plus 2 from this rare note, so we're getting 4 Essence every time we kill a mob. This is going to make it so we basically have infinite Essence. Between this and the pet and everything else, we're pretty much going to have infinite Essence in AoE. And we're going to be running the Exploit Glyph here, because it gives us basically just a straight up 10% damage multiplier. We're going to be taking Flesh Eater. So this is the other piece that makes the Sacrilege so good, because the Sacrilege is going to constantly eat corpses, right? And after he eats 5 corpses, we're going to get a 40% damage buff. So we end up getting incredibly good uptime on Flesh Eater without ever having to think about it. And on here, we're running the Amplify Glyph for 10% damage against cursed enemies. Coming over to this board, we have Scent of Death, which is going to give us damage reduction when there's no corpse, or when there are corpses nearby, and when there aren't any corpses, we're going to get 15% damage. So this is really good for bossing because you spawn corpses under the boss, not under you, so you get the 15% damage buff. Corporeal is extremely good as well. It's just going to give us a flat 10% damage. And then we are taking Essence, and Essence is going to give us a 22% damage multiplier against enemies that aren't healthy. This is going to give us basically 22% damage against bosses and against trash and stuff. So your first spear will make them not healthy, and then when your shards come back, they'll get the crit damage buff from this. So this ends up being a really nice damage buff, even if you're one-shotting stuff. Finally, we're running the Control Glyph, which is going to give us a damage multiplier against slowed and stunned enemies, which our Corpse Tendrils is doing both. So that's the build. This is God Mode Necromancer. I hope you like it. I love this build. It's so fun to play. And if you did like it, my name is Ruse, and leave a like and a comment, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you for watching. See ya.